Hello there, my name is Benedetta and welcome to Tender is the Read. In today's video, I want to talk to you about some big classics that I think are totally worth your time. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you will have noticed that I tend to praise short books a lot. I think they're a great way to get into classics without the huge commitment, and I also think that they're just a good way to get confidence in reading in general anyway. I would say that if you look at my stats on the Storygraph, I definitely tend to read books that are short to medium length the most, and I think that's pretty natural, of course, but it's not totally a good representation of what I actually enjoy reading, because in fact I love reading a big brick of a book every once in a while, and I think that amongst classics, these so-called maximalist epic novels are always a great time for me. I find myself loving them time and time again, and so in today's video I have just put together a few of them, and this is my personal love letter to these big boys that have kept me company for so long. It's been such a pleasure reading them, and I hope to share the love for them with you too. So without further ado, let me tell you about some great maximalist novels that you should definitely read in your lifetime. So at number one, my favorite probably, I have to say, is Vanity Fair by William and Thackeray. This is the story that essentially revolves around two young women called Becky Sharp and Amelia Sedley as they sort of navigate and grow up in high society in England during the time of the Napoleonic Wars. It is subtitled A Novel Without a Hero, which is just a perfect description of what you're gonna be delivered in the other 700 plus pages. Vanity Fair is sort of a satirical work, is very much a critique of society at the time, and it is narrated by Thackeray in the role of the narrator with such wit that is just such a joy to read. All of the things that happen are a bit absurdist, and they really highlight how rotten and corrupted everyone is. Specifically Becky, our protagonist, she is just the embodiment of cunning and determination. She comes from a less privileged background, so she is just dead set on making herself comfortable in life, and she will go to any length to do so, and oftentimes through the way that she can not con her way but definitely just work the people around her. That's the way the society gets criticized the most, until she herself sort of becomes the butt of the joke by the end of the novel. And on the other hand, you have Amelia, who is a much more demure and simply pure girl who becomes sort of the victim of her circumstances a little bit, and nevertheless she remains stoic in the face of it all, and she's somebody who gives some heart to the story for sure. If you, like me, love an anti-hero, I think that you'll just absolutely love Becky. She is one of my top favorite protagonists in literature for sure. I think what I like the most about it is the irony that permeates this entire book. It's just a genuinely great time. It's fun, it's super entertaining. I just couldn't put it down. I finished it way too quickly for my own good because I definitely wanted more. The next book I want to talk about is one that in many ways I consider to be Vanity Fair's spiritual successor, even though it isn't, although there is a textual reference that I love, but nevertheless, I'm talking about Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. This book follows the story of Southern belle Scarlett O'Hara as her life is completely changed by the Civil War, which happens during her formative years pretty much. Scarlett is once again an anti-hero at most. She definitely is not the most sympathetic character. She is spoiled, she's bratty, she is cunning, does things that are extremely questionable, and that's ignoring all the very real, racism and problematic things that happen in this book. Nevertheless, through this story, I could see a very sharp critique at society at the time. I know that realistically this book is, as I said, permeated with a lot of Southern propaganda, and it's something that you should know before going into it, and I think that the intentions of the author are a bit misguided at best, even it with the most positive of readings. She is obviously coming from a place of ignorance. It's not an excuse, of course. At the same time, I also do think that if you sort of remove those aspects, or if you take them as sort of the historical relic that they are, and they just elicit, you know, anger and reflection on you like they did for me, the story itself is just so fascinating, and once again, I couldn't put this down. The characters in this are all so gorgeous. I mean, Scarlett herself is also given time to sort of build her character, become resilient, become somebody who seeks independence, even though everything she's always wanted was to be somebody's wife. The other highlights are, of course, the male protagonist, the legendary Rhett Butler, one of the most amazing, you know, romantic leads in any novel ever. He is a subversive Southern gentleman. His values are a bit grey, but nevertheless, he really becomes the voice for certain reflections and considerations that I think are very much needed in the context of the novel, and he remains definitely what will keep you reading because he's just so fascinating and intriguing. At over 1,000 pages, this book really builds such a strong narrative, and it has one of the most iconic endings in literature. I really do recommend you read this book. Approach it critically. That is something that I should say. That's a big disclaimer, but nevertheless, this is just such an epic love story, and yeah, it's wonderful. Next up, we have War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This novel chronicles the Napoleonic invasion of Russia from the point of view of several families of the Russian aristocracy. You may notice a trend with wars being pretty fundamental to all of these maximalist novels, but the way War and Peace takes it is just way more extreme. As the title suggests, you have entire sections dedicated to following our characters in their campaigns during the Napoleonic Wars, and these sections serve as a way for Tolstoy to sometimes even just express his philosophical reflections and give such height to this novel. It's not simply a historical narrative, it's so much more than that. I will admit in my shallow way that my favorite parts were the peace ones, just because of all the intrigue that Tolstoy is able to build up. We're following so many different characters and different sort of families with all their dynamics between the youth and the elderly and the constraints of high society. Tolstoy really surprises at every twist and turn as people fall in love, but their relationships cannot happen for one reason or another, either the wars or some parents' disapproval, and the fact that at the time being in love was just not enough to arrange a marriage. And I don't know, it's just really fascinating. I would say that the heart of the whole story is Natasha, who is a young girl who is at the center of many of these romantic intrigues. It's really sort of a time capsule of a time in which life was changing so fast in Russia because of the war, but also because of the Industrial Revolution and the Tsarist society just slowly crumbling. I just really enjoy narratives that really take their time and that progress through several years and really show the progress of each character, their actual growth. It's just so wonderful, and it's written in a way that is just poetic, beautiful, and it'll keep you hooked. I love War and Peace so much. I really want to read it again because it's been a long time, but it's just really stayed with me and I would really recommend it. Next up, I have a book that literally everybody loved. It's The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandra Dumas. You'll have seen so many people talk about this because, first of all, it's one of those classics that, despite being super huge, gets studied in school in the US, so it's continuously rediscovered by the new generations, and a lot of people do actually enjoy it, which, I mean, I wasn't one who really enjoyed books that I was forced to read in school, but essentially this is the epic story of Edmond Dantes, who is a sailor who gets imprisoned unjustly by his sort of rivals and eventually makes his return after he has escaped and made a fortune. And as the Count of Monte Cristo, he introduces himself back into society and he embarks on a path to revenge. Now, I think the premise alone is so fascinating, and the way that it's developed throughout the plot is really even more so. The Count himself is this intriguing figure of mystery in text, but also to us in a way. We know that he's obviously seeking revenge, but we don't really know how. It's just something that remains sort of a mystery throughout, and it's just beautiful beautiful to see it all untangled eventually. All of the characters here are so interesting. They represent such different values. The general theme of this book is definitely one of hope as well as revenge, of justice as well as mercy, providence, and it's just so brilliant. This is another one that, funny enough, is connected to Napoleon. This one is set at the time of his escape from Elba, from his first exile. Then it's more into the Bourbon Restoration. But anyway, you definitely need to read this if you haven't already. It's super entertaining, it's a beautiful adventure story, and it's got great morals, so I really highly recommend it. Now, next up I have Middlemarch by George Eliot, which is one of the most unique maximalist novels. Middlemarch is the name of a fictional town in the English Midlands in which the story is set. And in fact, it can be said to be the protagonist of the story in a way. The subtitle for this book is A Study of Provincial Life, and it sets out to investigate the most mundane setting ever, which is apparently the background for great internal struggles. Unlike all the other books that I've talked about so far, there is no big war looming in the background. The only threat is the change brought about by the Industrial Revolution, the advancements in medicine, for example, and how that sort of changes the status quo. The characters mostly deal with coming to terms with the changing role of women and their position in society, issues related to marriage and what that entails, but also themes of religion, hypocrisy, education or lack thereof. The protagonist here is Dorothea, who is a woman with great ambition and determination, but who really feels the weight of having been born at the wrong time and not being able to fulfill her potential that she sees herself having. This is one of the masterpieces of realism, and even though you may find it, by the way I've described it, quite harsh, it's far from hopeless or bleak. In fact, this is just, in a way, a story of resilience. It's a criticism of society that emphasizes individual strength. I really think that George Eliot, who of course used a male pseudonym but is a woman, really expressed all of her best qualities here. She's just such a gifted author with an eye for things that many of her contemporaries just completely missed. I think it's not a coincidence that this was named as the greatest British novel of all time. The next book I have is one that just makes the cut for this video as it comes at like 630 pages-ish, and I'm talking about The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. I am so fond of this story, so I had to include it here. The Three Musketeers is a historical novel that centers around four characters actually, the Three Musketeers themselves and then the aspiring musketeer D'Artagnan, as they work at the court of Louis XIII and they have to balance their loyalties and interests between the Queen Anne of Austria, Cardinal of Richelieu, Duke of Buckingham and the King himself. I think that this is such a fun novel. It's an adventure that keeps on giving. It's almost episodic in nature. The plot itself is just a continuous amount of little episodes that happen and they're part of a bigger intrigue that the musketeers have to unveil in order to save the kingdom. They're obviously dealing with issues that could have changed the course of history, and of course their intervention is absolutely providential. Of course this is an exercise of fiction, but nevertheless I think it's so fascinating to see real life historical figures being portrayed here, being given such a personality and inserting fictional characters into real life events like the death of the Duke of Buckingham, for example. As a novel itself, it is just another great adventure. I don't think this has the depth of some of the other novels, but it's just a good time. I just wanted to give it a shout out because it is one of the stories that I've loved since childhood. And finally here I have another novel by Leo Tolstoy, and this time it's Anna Karenina. Now Tolstoy himself actually called this his first novel because he thought that War and Peace wasn't a novel per se, it was something something a bit different, way more complex. But on the other hand, Anna Karenina is just the epitome of the Russian novel, the way I see it. Once again, we enter the setting of aristocratic Russia and deal with several families and how they're all entangled and related. Our central character and protagonist is this beautiful woman of high society who basically falls in love and decides to break her marriage to pursue this romance. This is one of the most acclaimed stories of passion of all time. The way the characters approach life, and they are just so open to throw all their past to the wind in order to pursue what they perceive as their happiness, is just really interesting and makes for an extremely fascinating story. I don't know that I would consider Anna an anti-hero in the same way of Scarlett or Becky, in the sense that when she does things that are sort of immoral, she does so without the determination of the others. She is very much split between her passion and the fact that she obviously has a child that she's set to lose from abandoning her husband. But at the same time, she refuses to hear any reason. She is a very fascinating character. I don't know that I always love her. In fact, she's definitely not one of my favorite protagonists, I will say that. But nevertheless, this book features much more than just her, and even her internal conflict is so captivating to read. Tolstoy's writing is marvelous. I love his settings, you know, all the glamour that comes with Russia at this time in history, which is once again set in some war that unfortunately I cannot remember. And there's plenty of opportunities for Tolstoy to express some of his feelings about faith and the trials and tribulation of human lives that are quite interesting to read through the character of Levin. This is a book that I had put off for several years because the idea of this central plot being about betrayal and you know, cheating in a relationship was something that I didn't want it to be romanticized. But I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that that's not what Anna Karenina does at all. It's complex, it's sympathetic, but it's also honest. It's definitely something that you should read at least once in your lifetime. Okay, so that was all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know if you have any big book that you love. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you next time. Bye!